There comes a moment when you stop saying, "I'm just tired," and start feeling something deeper that you can't easily name. It's not physical exhaustion. It's a quiet emptiness that settles in your chest, like something inside you has been carrying too much for too long without relief. You still wake up. You still move. You still do what needs to be done. But something feels different now. Conversations feel distant. Motivation feels forced. Even the things that used to excite you don't land the same way anymore, and that shift is hard to ignore. At first, you try to brush it off. You tell yourself it's just a phase, just stress, just a bad stretch of days. But deep down, you know it's more than that, because this feeling doesn't leave when you rest. It follows you quietly into every moment. And the hardest part is, you can't point to one clear reason. There's no single event you can blame, no obvious turning point. It's like something slowly changed over time, piece by piece, until you woke up one day and didn't feel like yourself anymore. Maybe it was the constant pressure, the expectations, the moments you had to stay strong when you didn't feel strong, the times you kept going even when you wanted to stop. Those moments don't disappear, they build silently until something inside you starts to crack. You begin to notice it in small ways. Your patience shortens. Your thoughts become heavier. You question things you never questioned before. And slowly, without realizing it, you start turning that weight inward, wondering if the problem is you. That's where it becomes dangerous. Not because you're actually broken, but because you start to believe you are. And once that belief takes hold, everything you feel begins to confirm it. Every setback feels bigger. Every mistake feels more personal. But what if this isn't brokenness? What if this is a transition that just doesn't look like one? What if you've reached a point where the version of you that carried you this far can't take you any further, and now something new is trying to emerge? Because there's a stage in every person's growth where things stop making sense, where your usual ways of coping don't work anymore, where pushing harder only makes you feel more disconnected. And in that stage, it's easy to assume something is wrong. Most people try to escape it. They distract themselves, numb it, or rush to fix it. But what if this moment isn't meant to be fixed quickly? What if it's meant to be understood, slowly, patiently, without forcing an immediate answer? There is something still alive in you, even if it feels quiet right now. You wouldn't be searching for clarity if there was nothing left. You wouldn't be listening, reflecting, questioning. That means something in you is still moving, still reaching, and that part of you matters more than you think. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's steady. It's the part that hasn't given up, even when everything feels uncertain. And if you learn to notice it, you'll realize it never actually left. Because being in this state doesn't mean you've lost yourself. It means you've outgrown something. It means you're standing in a space between who you were and who you're becoming. And that space is always uncomfortable. You don't need to have everything figured out right now. You don't need to feel strong every moment. What matters is that you don't define this feeling too quickly, because once you label it as the end, you stop looking for what it could become. So pause for a moment. Let yourself sit with what you're feeling without rushing to judge it. There is something here beneath the surface that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And if you stay with it, it may begin to show you something you didn't expect. Because what feels like breaking is often the beginning of something reorganizing at a deeper level, something you couldn't access before, something that requires you to let go of what no longer works, even if it feels unfamiliar at first. And if you can hold on just a little longer, if you can resist the urge to give this feeling a final meaning, you may begin to see that this isn't the end of your strength. It's the moment your strength starts taking a completely new form. There comes a period in the life of every individual when the familiar patterns of thought and action begin to lose their force, not because the individual has failed, but because he has unknowingly reached the limit of what his present understanding can sustain. In this period, a man may continue his daily movements, yet feel as though something within him has withdrawn its former certainty, leaving behind a strange and unfamiliar stillness. This condition is often mistaken for weakness, for society has trained men to associate strength with constant motion, constant certainty, and constant enthusiasm. Yet there exists a deeper form of strength that does not announce itself loudly, but instead begins its work quietly beneath the surface of conscious awareness. It is in this quiet turning that the foundations of a greater life are being prepared. The fatigue that accompanies this state is not of the body, for the body may rest and recover with ease. It is the fatigue of carrying thoughts, expectations, and burdens that no longer align with the deeper desires of the individual. It is the exhaustion that comes from maintaining a version of oneself that has already fulfilled its purpose, yet continues to be held in place by habit and necessity. Many who pass through this stage attempt to escape it through distraction, believing that activity alone will restore their former sense of clarity. They immerse themselves in work, in conversation, in external pursuits, hoping to outrun the feeling that follows them. Yet, the more they attempt to escape, the more persistent the feeling becomes, for it is not something that can be outrun. It is something that must be understood. It is important to recognize that no man begins to feel disconnected from his former self until he has first outgrown the conditions that once defined him. The very discomfort he experiences is evidence that something within him is seeking expansion. What he interprets as loss is often the first signal that a greater capacity is attempting to emerge. Consider the individual who has long operated under pressure, fulfilling responsibilities, meeting expectations, and maintaining strength in moments when he would rather have rested. Each of these moments leaves an impression upon the mind. Though they may seem small in isolation, their accumulation forms a weight that is carried silently, without recognition, until it begins to influence the very structure of thought itself. As this weight increases, the mind begins to alter its own rhythm. Thoughts that once came easily now require effort. Motivations that once felt natural now feel forced. Even the simple act of engaging with others may begin to feel distant, as though one is present in body but removed in spirit. This is not because the individual has lost his ability, but because the mind is in the process of reorganizing itself. At this stage, many make the critical error of turning their attention inward with judgment rather than curiosity. They begin to question their worth, their strength, and their capacity, assuming that the change they feel must be the result of some personal deficiency. This misinterpretation is one of the greatest dangers a man may face, for it leads him to build conclusions upon incomplete understanding. In truth, the mind is never idle. It is always in motion, always responding to the impressions it receives and the thoughts it entertains. When the conditions of life demand more than the current structure of the mind can support, the mind does not collapse, it begins to adapt. This adaptation, however, does not always present itself in a manner that is immediately understood. There is a law of growth which dictates that before any new structure may be formed, the old must first loosen its hold. This loosening often feels like instability. It may feel like uncertainty, like confusion, like the loss of direction. Yet these sensations are not signs of failure. They are signs that the mind is preparing to reorganize itself on a higher level. History provides countless examples of individuals who have passed through such periods. Andrew Carnegie himself experienced seasons of deep dissatisfaction before discovering the principles that would later define his success. He did not interpret these moments as evidence of inadequacy, but as signals that he had not yet aligned himself with his true purpose. The difference between those who rise from such periods and those who remain confined within them lies not in the absence of discomfort, but in the interpretation of it. The one who sees discomfort as an enemy will resist it and prolong his struggle. The one who sees it as a messenger will begin to listen, and in listening, will discover the direction in which he must move. It is also during this stage that the individual may begin to notice subtle changes in how others perceive him. Though he may feel uncertain within, there is often a quiet strength that begins to emerge, one that is not rooted in outward confidence, but in inward endurance. Others may sense this change, even if they cannot fully understand it, and may begin to regard him with a different kind of respect. This respect does not come from visible achievement, but from the unseen work taking place within the mind. It is the recognition of a man who continues to stand, even when the ground beneath him feels unfamiliar. It is the acknowledgement of a presence that is no longer driven solely by external demands, but is beginning to be guided by something deeper. In such moments, it becomes essential for the individual to refrain from assigning a final meaning to his condition. The human mind has a tendency to seek closure, to label experiences quickly in order to regain a sense of control. Yet premature conclusions often lead to unnecessary limitation. To declare oneself broken is to halt the process that is attempting to rebuild. Instead, one must adopt a posture of observation. He must learn to sit with his thoughts without immediately reacting to them. He must allow the feeling to exist without rushing to eliminate it. For it is within this space of observation that clarity begins to form, slowly and deliberately. There is something within every individual that remains untouched by confusion. It is not loud, nor does it demand attention, but it persists. It is the part of the mind that continues to seek understanding even when everything else feels uncertain. The very act of searching for clarity is evidence that this part is still active. It is this quiet persistence that must be recognized and nurtured. For it is not the absence of difficulty that defines strength, but the presence of continued movement in the face of it. A man may feel uncertain. He may feel disconnected. He may feel as though he has lost his way. Yet if he continues to seek, he has not lost himself. The greatest mistake one can make in this stage is to define it too quickly. To call it an ending is to close the door on what it may become. To call it failure is to overlook the transformation taking place beneath the surface. What appears as breaking is often the rearrangement of forces that will later produce strength of a higher order. Therefore, let the individual pause. Let him resist the urge to rush forward or retreat backward. Let him remain present with what he feels, without judgment, without haste. For within this state lies the beginning of something that cannot be accessed through comfort alone. And let him affirm, not with forced conviction, but with quiet certainty. There is nothing within me that is broken. There is only something within me that is changing its form, preparing me for a greater expression of my life. There is a peculiar tendency of the human mind to seek immediate explanations for conditions it does not yet understand. When a man encounters a state of inner conflict, his first impulse is not to observe it patiently, but to define it quickly. He reaches for the nearest conclusion, not because it is accurate, but because it offers a temporary sense of control over what feels uncertain. It is in this moment that many begin to form beliefs that shape the remainder of their experience. A passing state becomes a permanent identity. A temporary confusion is labeled as failure. A period of transition is mistaken for collapse. And once the mind accepts such interpretations, it begins to gather evidence to support them, reinforcing the very condition it seeks to escape. This is the subtle power of belief. The mind does not merely reflect reality, it participates in creating it. Whatever a man consistently tells himself, whether true or false, begins to influence his perception, his actions, and ultimately his results. Thus, a single misinterpretation, if repeated often enough, may grow into a conviction that governs his entire life. Fear plays a significant role in this process. Not the fear that arises from immediate danger, but the quieter, more persistent form that distorts judgment and magnifies uncertainty. This fear does not announce itself openly. It disguises itself as logic, as caution, as realism. It whispers to the individual that something is wrong, that he has lost his way, that he is no longer capable of what he once was. Under the influence of such fear, the mind begins to narrow its focus. It turns away from possibility and fixates upon limitation. It begins to interpret neutral events as negative and minor setbacks as confirmation of deeper inadequacy. In this state, even the absence of progress may feel like evidence of decline. Yet, what the individual fails to recognize is that confusion is not the absence of direction, it is the presence of competing directions. It is the indication that the old patterns no longer suffice, and the new patterns have not yet fully formed. It is the space between what was and what will be, and though it feels uncertain, it is rich with potential. Thomas Edison, whose name is now associated with invention and persistence, passed through countless moments that could have been interpreted as failure. Had he chosen to define his efforts by their immediate results, he would have abandoned his work long before achieving success. Instead, he viewed each unsuccessful attempt not as a defeat, but as information and adjustment that brought him closer to his aim. The difference lay not in his circumstances, but in his interpretation of them. Where others might have seen limitation, he saw opportunity. Where others might have felt discouraged, he found direction. His power did not come from the absence of difficulty, but from his refusal to assign it a negative meaning. This principle applies to every individual who finds himself in a state of inner conflict. The thoughts that arise during such periods are not always reliable indicators of truth. They are often reflections of temporary conditions, shaped by fatigue, pressure, and uncertainty. To accept them without question is to allow the mind to operate without discipline. Discipline of thought is among the greatest powers a man may develop. It is the ability to observe one's own thinking without becoming controlled by it. It is the capacity to question conclusions, to examine beliefs, and to choose deliberately which ideas shall be allowed to take root. Without this discipline, the mind becomes a field in which any passing thought may grow unchecked. Negative impressions, if repeated, begin to dominate. Doubt, if entertained, begins to expand. And gradually the individual may find himself living in a reality shaped more by fear than by fact. It is also in this stage that the individual may begin to compare himself to others, seeking reassurance through external measurement. He observes those who appear certain, those who seem to move with confidence, and he concludes that his own uncertainty is a sign of inferiority. Yet such comparisons are rarely accurate, for they are based on appearances rather than understanding. Every individual passes through periods of uncertainty, whether visible or concealed. The difference lies in how they are navigated. Some conceal their struggles behind outward composure, while others allow them to shape their identity. The presence of uncertainty is not what defines a man, it is his response to it that determines his course. The mind, when left undirected, tends to gravitate toward the most immediate and emotionally charged interpretation. It does not naturally seek truth, it seeks resolution. And resolution, when pursued without patience, often leads to conclusions that are incomplete or incorrect. For this reason, it becomes essential for the individual to cultivate a different approach. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" he must learn to ask, "What is changing within me?" Instead of seeking to eliminate discomfort, he must seek to understand it. For understanding transforms what appears as a problem into a process. There is a profound difference between a man who reacts to his thoughts and a man who examines them. The former becomes subject to every fluctuation of the mind, while the latter gains authority over his internal world. This authority does not come from suppressing thought, but from directing it. When a man begins to direct his thoughts, he begins to reshape his experience. He no longer accepts every feeling as fact, nor every doubt as truth. He recognizes that his mind is capable of producing both constructive and destructive ideas, and he takes responsibility for choosing which shall guide him. This is not accomplished in a single moment, nor through a single decision. It is the result of repeated effort, of returning again and again to a position of awareness. It requires patience, for the habits of thought that have been formed over time do not change instantly. Yet with persistence, they may be redirected. As this redirection takes place, the individual begins to notice subtle changes. The weight of his thoughts becomes lighter. The intensity of his doubts begins to diminish. The sense of being overwhelmed gives way to a quiet clarity that grows stronger with each deliberate choice. Others may begin to observe this change as well. Where once there was visible strain, there is now a composed presence. Where there was hesitation, there is now measured action. This shift does not arise from external circumstances, but from the internal decision to no longer be governed by misinterpretation. It is important to remember that the mind does not cease to produce thoughts, nor does it eliminate all uncertainty. What changes is the individual's relationship to these thoughts. He becomes less reactive, more observant, and increasingly capable of maintaining direction regardless of internal fluctuation. This is the beginning of mental mastery. It is not the elimination of difficulty, but the ability to navigate it without losing oneself. It is the recognition that thoughts are tools, not commands, and that belief is a choice, not a consequence. Therefore, let the individual adopt a new principle, one that shall guide him through moments of confusion. I refuse to interpret this moment as defeat. I understand that what I feel is temporary, and that within it lies the instruction I require for my next advancement. And in holding to this principle, he will find that what once appeared as a barrier becomes a doorway, and what once felt like an ending reveals itself as the beginning of a higher form of understanding. There comes a stage in the progress of every individual where the greatest obstacle he must overcome is not found in the external world, but within the structure of his own identity. This obstacle does not present itself as an obvious enemy. It appears instead as familiarity, habits of thought, patterns of behavior, and ways of seeing oneself that have long gone unquestioned. A man becomes accustomed to who he believes himself to be. He builds his decisions, his expectations, and even his limitations around this belief. Over time, this identity becomes so firmly established that it begins to feel permanent. Yet no identity is fixed. It is merely the result of repeated thoughts, reinforced by experience and accepted without examination. When growth begins to take place, this identity is the first to feel its effects. The thoughts that once aligned with it begin to lose their influence. The actions that once felt natural begin to feel forced. The individual may find himself resisting impulses that once guided him easily, not because he has lost his ability, but because those impulses no longer serve the direction in which he is being led. This is the breaking of the former identity. It is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual loosening. The beliefs that once seemed certain begin to feel incomplete. The goals that once appeared desirable lose their appeal. The methods that once produced results begin to yield diminishing returns. This creates a sense of instability, for the foundation upon which the individual has operated is no longer as solid as it once appeared. Many interpret this instability as danger. They attempt to restore the former identity, to return to the habits and patterns that once brought them certainty. They cling to what is familiar, even when it no longer satisfies them. For the unknown feels more threatening than the unsatisfactory known. Yet this effort is in vain. For once the mind has recognized the limitations of its former patterns, it cannot fully return to them. The awareness that has been gained cannot be undone. The individual may attempt to resume his former way of living, but he will find that it no longer fits him as it once did. What was once comfortable now feels restrictive. What was once motivating now feels hollow. This is the precise point at which many abandon their progress. They conclude that something has gone wrong. They believe that they have lost their drive, their clarity, or their purpose. In truth, they have lost nothing of value. What they have lost is the illusion that their former identity was sufficient for their continued growth. Henry Ford, before becoming one of the most influential figures in industrial history, faced repeated moments in which his ideas were dismissed, his methods questioned, and his direction misunderstood. Had he clung to the conventional thinking of his time, he would have remained within the limits of what was already known. Instead, he allowed his former understanding to be challenged, and in doing so, he created something entirely new. This willingness to release the former identity is the mark of every individual who advances beyond the ordinary. There exists a law which governs all progress, that no new structure may be built upon a foundation that refuses to change. The old must give way, not because it was wrong, but because it has completed its purpose. To resist this law is to remain confined within the limits of one's past. The breaking of identity is therefore not an act of destruction, but an act of preparation. It clears the space in which a greater structure may be formed. It removes the limitations that once defined the individual, allowing him to expand beyond them. It creates the conditions necessary for a new way of thinking, acting, and being to emerge. Yet this process is not without discomfort. The mind, accustomed to certainty, resists the absence of it. It seeks to regain control, to reestablish familiar patterns, to restore what has been lost. During this time, the individual may feel as though he is without direction, without stability, and without a clear sense of who he is. This feeling is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the previous definition of self is no longer adequate. It is in this space between the dissolution of the old and the formation of the new that the individual must exercise the greatest degree of patience. He must resist the urge to define himself too quickly. He must allow the process to unfold without forcing it into a familiar shape. For it is only through this allowance that something truly new may emerge. Others may begin to notice a change during this stage. Though the individual himself may feel uncertain, there is often a quiet strength that becomes visible to those around him. It is not the strength of confidence born from certainty, but the strength of endurance born from transition. There is a steadiness in one who continues forward without full clarity. There is a depth in one who is willing to question himself without collapsing under the weight of that questioning. This depth is often recognized by others, even if they cannot fully explain it. They may begin to see in him a presence that is less reactive, less dependent upon external validation, and more grounded in something that is still forming. This perception, though subtle, marks the beginning of a shift not only within the individual, but in how he is received by the world. It is also during this phase that the individual must learn the value of releasing attachment, not only to outcomes, but to his previous understanding of himself. He must recognize that growth requires space, and that space cannot exist where the old is held too tightly. To release does not mean to abandon. It means to acknowledge that something has fulfilled its role and is no longer required in its present form. It is an act of recognition, not rejection. The man who masters this act gains access to a level of freedom that cannot be achieved through external means. He is no longer bound by the need to maintain a fixed identity. He becomes adaptable, capable of evolving in response to new understanding. This adaptability is one of the greatest advantages a man may possess. It allows him to navigate change without losing direction. It enables him to grow without becoming confined by his past. It positions him to take advantage of opportunities that would remain invisible to one who is fixed in his thinking. Yet this mastery is not achieved without effort. It requires the individual to remain conscious of his thoughts, to question his assumptions, and to resist the pull of familiarity when it no longer serves him. It demands that he trust the process of transformation, even when the outcome is not yet visible. Above all, it requires that he adopt a new understanding of what it means to feel uncertain. Uncertainty is not the absence of identity. It is the presence of multiple possibilities. It is the indication that the individual is no longer confined to a single way of being, but is in the process of discovering a broader expression of himself. To embrace this uncertainty is to embrace growth. To resist it is to remain unchanged. Therefore, let the individual stand firm in this stage, not seeking immediate answers, but allowing them to arise in their proper time. Let him recognize that the discomfort he feels is not a signal to retreat, but an invitation to expand. And let him affirm with quiet conviction, I release the version of myself that has completed its purpose. I do not resist the change taking place within me, for I understand that it is preparing me for a greater expression of my life. After the former identity has loosened its hold and the mind has passed through the uncertain interval between what was and what will be, there begins a process that is less visible, yet far more decisive in its effect. This is the stage in which the mind, having been relieved of its previous limitations, begins to reorganize itself according to a higher pattern. This reorganization does not occur through force. It is not something that can be rushed, nor can it be commanded into existence through mere desire. It unfolds according to a natural law, one that governs all growth, whether of the mind, the body, or the conditions of life. That law is this: when space has been created, something new will seek to occupy it. The individual who has allowed the former structure of his thinking to dissolve has, without fully realizing it, created such space. Into this space, new thoughts begin to emerge, ideas that were previously inaccessible, perceptions that were once obscured, and impulses that now feel more aligned with something deeper and more enduring. At first, these new impressions may appear faint. They do not arrive with the same force as the old habits once did. They are quieter, more deliberate, and often require attention in order to be recognized. Yet within them lies a power that far exceeds the noise of the former patterns. It is in this stage that the individual must learn the value of stillness, for it is in stillness that the mind becomes receptive. When the constant activity of forced thinking is reduced, the mind begins to operate with greater precision. Thoughts no longer arise from reaction, but from reflection. Ideas are no longer scattered, but begin to take shape in a more organized and purposeful manner. This is the beginning of true mental control. The man who reaches this stage and recognizes its importance gains an advantage that few possess. He begins to understand that his thoughts are not merely responses to external conditions, but tools through which he may shape those conditions. He moves from being influenced by his environment to influencing it. Yet this shift requires discipline. The new thoughts that emerge must be nurtured. They must be repeated, examined, and strengthened through deliberate attention. For while the old patterns have weakened, they have not disappeared entirely. They remain, waiting to reassert themselves if the new structure is not firmly established. Herein lies the importance of repetition. It is not enough for a man to encounter a new idea once and expect it to transform his life. The mind is shaped by what it experiences repeatedly. Just as the former identity was built through repetition, so must the new identity be constructed through the same process. However, repetition must not be mistaken for monotony. When applied with understanding, repetition becomes a means of reinforcement, not of dullness. Each time a constructive thought is entertained, it gains strength. Each time it is acted upon, it becomes more firmly embedded. And over time, what once required effort begins to occur naturally. Napoleon Hill himself, in his own journey, found that the principles of success could not be applied once and forgotten. They required continuous engagement. Each repetition brought greater clarity, deeper understanding, and more consistent results. It was through this persistent application that his philosophy became not merely a theory, but a lived reality. As the mind reorganizes, another change begins to take place. Emotional energy, which was once scattered and often directed toward unproductive ends, becomes more focused. The individual finds that he is no longer as easily disturbed by minor inconveniences. His reactions become measured. His responses become intentional. He begins to conserve his energy, directing it toward what truly matters. This conservation of energy is one of the most significant developments in this stage, for it is not the amount of effort a man exerts that determines his results, but the direction in which that effort is applied. A scattered mind produces scattered results. A focused mind produces concentrated power. This power, though subtle at first, begins to manifest in observable ways. Others may begin to notice a difference in the individual's presence. There is a calmness where there was once restlessness. There is a clarity where there was once confusion. There is a sense of purpose, even if it has not yet been fully defined. This presence does not demand attention, yet it attracts it. People are naturally drawn to those who exhibit control over their own minds. They sense stability. They perceive confidence, not as a display, but as a state of being. And in this perception, they begin to place trust. This trust becomes a form of influence. Without speaking a word, the individual begins to affect those around him. His composure influences their reactions. His clarity influences their thinking. His direction influences their perception of what is possible. This is the early formation of what may later become leadership. Not the leadership that is imposed, but the leadership that is recognized. It is important, however, that the individual does not become distracted by these external reflections, for the work of reorganization is not yet complete. There remains a need for continued attention, continued discipline, and continued refinement of thought. The mind, though reorganizing, must be guided. It must be directed toward ideas that align with growth, with purpose, and with constructive action. It must be protected from influences that would disrupt its emerging order. For while the individual has gained strength, he is not yet immune to regression. This protection is achieved through conscious selection. The thoughts a man entertains, the influences he allows, and the environments he places himself within all contribute to the structure of his mind. By choosing these carefully, he reinforces the new order. By neglecting them, he risks allowing disorder to return. This is not a matter of isolation, but of intention. The individual need not withdraw from the world, but he must engage with it deliberately. He must become aware of what strengthens him and what weakens him, and act accordingly. As this awareness increases, so too does his capacity for control. He begins to recognize patterns within his own thinking. He sees how certain thoughts lead to certain feelings, and how those feelings influence his actions. With this recognition comes the ability to intervene, to redirect, to adjust, and to refine. This is the foundation of mastery. Not mastery over others, but mastery over oneself. And it is from this mastery that all external success is ultimately derived. For no man may achieve lasting success without first establishing order within his own mind. External achievements, when not supported by internal structure, are temporary. They cannot be sustained, for they lack the foundation required to support them. But when the mind is organized, when thought is directed, and when energy is focused, the individual becomes capable of producing results that are both consistent and enduring. He is no longer dependent upon circumstance. He is no longer subject to every fluctuation of his environment. He becomes instead a force within it. This force, though developed quietly, is unmistakable. It is the presence of a man who has begun to understand himself, who has begun to direct his thoughts, and who has begun to shape his life from within outward. And as this process continues, the next stage begins to reveal itself not through sudden revelation, but through gradual clarity. For when the mind has been reorganized, it becomes capable of recognizing something it could not previously see: direction, purpose, a definite aim. But before this aim is fully formed, the individual must remain steady within the process, trusting that what is being built within him is not accidental, but the result of a law as certain as any other. Therefore, let him continue without haste, without doubt, and without the need for immediate answers. And let him affirm with calm assurance, "My mind is organizing itself into a higher order. I do not rush this process, for I understand that in its completion lies the foundation of my future strength." When the mind has passed through confusion, released its former identity, and begun to reorganize itself into a higher order, there comes a moment quiet, often unexpected, when direction begins to reveal itself. It does not arrive as a sudden command, nor as a loud declaration. It emerges gradually, like light at the break of day, subtle at first, yet unmistakable once it is recognized. This is the awakening of definiteness of purpose. It is important to understand that purpose is not something that is forced into existence through effort alone. Many seek it through strain, believing that if they think long enough, analyze deeply enough, or search widely enough, they will arrive at a clear answer. Yet purpose does not respond to force. It responds to alignment. When the mind is scattered, purpose remains hidden. When the mind is burdened by conflicting thoughts, purpose cannot take form. But when the mind becomes organized, when thought is directed and energy is conserved, purpose begins to surface naturally, as though it had been present all along. waiting for the proper conditions to be revealed. At first, this sense of purpose may not appear as a complete picture. It may present itself as a leaning, an inclination, a quiet pull toward a particular direction. The individual may feel drawn toward certain ideas, certain pursuits, or certain ways of expressing himself that were not as evident before. These inclinations must not be ignored, for they are the early signals of a deeper alignment taking place within the mind. They are not random. They are the result of the reorganization that has occurred, the natural consequence of a mind that has begun to operate in harmony with itself. Many, however, make the mistake of dismissing these early signals because they do not appear fully formed. They wait for absolute certainty before they act, believing that purpose must be clear in its entirety before it can be followed. Yet such certainty rarely arrives in advance. It is revealed through movement, not before it. The man who waits for complete clarity may wait indefinitely. The man who acts upon what clarity he possesses, however small, begins to develop it further. Each step taken in alignment with this emerging direction strengthens it. Each action provides new information, new experience, and new understanding. In this way, purpose becomes clearer through participation. This is the distinction between those who discover their purpose and those who remain in search of it. Discovery does not occur through passive observation. It occurs through active engagement. The individual must be willing to move, to experiment, to follow the direction that feels most aligned, even if it is not yet fully defined. There is also a difference between external goals and internal purpose that must be understood. External goals are often shaped by influence by what others expect, by what society values, or by what appears desirable. Internal purpose, however, arises from within. It is not imposed, it is recognized. A man may pursue many goals and still feel unfulfilled, for those goals may not be aligned with his deeper nature. But when he begins to act in accordance with his purpose, even small actions carry a sense of meaning that cannot be replicated by external achievement alone. This sense of meaning restores energy. Where there was once fatigue, there is now a quiet momentum. Where there was once hesitation, there is now a willingness to act. The individual no longer feels as though he must force himself forward. Instead, he finds himself drawn forward, guided by something that feels both natural and necessary. This is one of the clearest signs that purpose is beginning to take hold. The energy that accompanies it is not frantic, nor is it overwhelming. It is steady, it is consistent, it sustains itself, for it is not dependent upon external validation. It is rooted in alignment. As this alignment strengthens, the individual begins to make decisions with greater ease. Indecision, which once consumed time and energy, begins to diminish. The question is no longer, what should I do? But does this align with my direction? And with this question comes clarity. Actions that align are pursued. Those that do not are released without unnecessary struggle. This simplicity is a form of power, for the man who knows his direction does not waste energy on what is irrelevant. He does not attempt to be everything at once. He concentrates his effort, and in doing so, increases its effectiveness. It is at this stage that others begin to observe a more noticeable change. Where once there was uncertainty, there is now direction. Where once there was inconsistency, there is now steadiness. The individual may not yet have achieved visible results, but there is a sense of certainty in his movement that commands attention. People are drawn to direction. They recognize it, even when it is still forming. They sense that the individual is no longer drifting, but moving with intention. This perception creates a form of influence, for others are naturally inclined to trust those who appear to know where they are going. This trust, once established, opens doors. Opportunities begin to present themselves, not by chance, but as a response to the clarity that has been developed. The individual, now aligned with his purpose, is able to recognize these opportunities where previously he may have overlooked them. This recognition is not accidental. It is the result of a mind that has become attuned to its direction. Just as a man who is focused upon a particular aim becomes more aware of everything related to it, so too does the individual aligned with his purpose begin to notice pathways that were once invisible. Yet even in this stage, caution must be exercised. Purpose, though powerful, must be nurtured with consistency. It is not enough to recognize it once. It must be reaffirmed through repeated action. It must be strengthened through persistence. For without continued engagement, it may lose its clarity and return to obscurity. This is why repetition remains essential, not as a means of forcing belief, but as a means of reinforcing alignment. Each time the individual acts in accordance with his purpose, he deepens his connection to it. Each time he reaffirms it in thought, he strengthens its presence within his mind. Over time, what began as a quiet inclination becomes a definite aim. It becomes something that can be expressed, pursued, and developed with intention. It becomes the central organizing force of the individual's life, guiding his actions, shaping his decisions, and influencing his results. This is the point at which purpose transforms from a feeling into a direction. And once this transformation occurs, the individual is no longer wandering. He is no longer searching without aim. He is moving deliberately and steadily toward something that he both understands and believes in. This belief is not blind. It is grounded in experience. It is supported by the internal changes that have taken place. It is reinforced by the results that begin to appear, however small at first. And as this belief grows, so too does the individual's confidence. Not the loud, outward display of confidence, but the quiet assurance that comes from knowing one's direction. It is a confidence that does not require validation, for it is rooted in alignment rather than appearance. Therefore, let the individual continue to move in accordance with this emerging purpose. Let him trust the direction that reveals itself through action. Let him remain steady, even when the path is not yet fully visible, for it is not necessary to see the entire path in order to walk it. It is only necessary to see the next step and to take it. And let him affirm with calm certainty, I am guided by a definite purpose that grows clearer with each step I take. I do not wait for certainty to act, for I know that clarity is revealed through movement. When a man has passed through confusion, released the weight of his former identity, disciplined his thoughts, and aligned himself with a definite purpose, there comes a realization that is both simple and profound. He begins to see that the strength he once believed he had lost was never truly gone. It had merely changed its form. In earlier stages of life, strength often appears as force. It expresses itself through urgency, through constant motion, through the need to prove, to push, and to persist against resistance. This form of strength is useful, for it carries a man through his initial struggles. Yet it is not the highest form, for there exists a greater strength, one that is not driven by pressure but by alignment. This strength does not require the individual to force himself into action. It does not depend upon external motivation or emotional intensity. It arises naturally as a result of the harmony that has been established within the mind. It is steady, composed, and enduring. The individual who reaches this stage begins to notice a change in how he responds to life. Where he once reacted quickly, he now responds with consideration. Where he once felt overwhelmed by circumstances, he now observes them with clarity. Challenges no longer appear as threats, but as conditions to be understood and directed. This shift is not the result of circumstance changing, but of perception evolving. The same situations that once produced doubt now produce insight. The same obstacles that once created resistance now reveal opportunity. The individual has not removed difficulty from his life. He has changed his relationship to it. This is the essence of resilience. True resilience is not the ability to avoid struggle, but the ability to remain composed within it. It is the capacity to endure without losing direction, to continue without becoming discouraged, and to adapt without abandoning one's purpose. Such resilience cannot be developed in comfort alone. It is forged through the very experiences that once caused uncertainty. Every moment of doubt, every period of confusion, every instance in which the individual chose to continue despite discomfort, these have all contributed to the formation of this new strength. Nothing has been wasted. What once felt like fragmentation has become foundation. As this understanding deepens, the individual begins to experience a form of momentum that is entirely different from what he once knew. It is no longer the forced momentum of obligation, but the natural momentum of alignment. Actions flow more easily. Decisions require less strain. Progress, though still requiring effort, feels more consistent. This consistency is the mark of maturity. It is the indication that the individual is no longer dependent upon fluctuating emotion to guide his actions. He does not wait to feel ready. He does not require perfect conditions. He acts because he is directed, and in acting he maintains his direction. Others begin to recognize this change more clearly now. Where once there may have been visible struggle, there is now quiet certainty. Where once there was inconsistency, there is now reliability. The individual becomes someone upon whom others may depend, not because he claims strength, but because he demonstrates it through his presence. This presence carries weight. It influences without effort. It commands respect without demand. It creates an impression of stability that others find reassuring, particularly in times of uncertainty. Such influence is not accidental. It is the natural result of a mind that has become ordered, a purpose that has become clear, and a character that has been shaped through experience. It is the outward expression of inner mastery. At this stage, the individual also begins to see his past differently. What once appeared as periods of struggle now reveal themselves as necessary steps. The moments he once wished to avoid are now understood as essential to his development. He no longer resents them. He values them. This shift in perspective is one of the greatest signs of transformation, for it indicates that the individual is no longer defined by his past, but informed by it. He carries forward the lessons, not the limitations. He uses his experiences as tools, not as burdens. There is also a noticeable change in how he approaches future challenges. He no longer anticipates them with fear, nor does he attempt to avoid them. He understands that each challenge contains within it the potential for further growth. He meets them with readiness, not resistance. This readiness is a form of confidence, though it does not resemble the confidence that seeks recognition. It is quiet. It is internal. It is based not on the expectation of success, but on the knowledge that he possesses the ability to respond effectively, regardless of outcome. This is what makes it unshakable, for it is not dependent upon circumstances, results, or approval. It is rooted in self-mastery, and as such, it remains stable even when external conditions change. The individual who reaches this level of strength is no longer easily influenced by the opinions of others. He listens, but he does not surrender his direction. He considers, but he does not abandon his purpose. He remains open, yet grounded. This balance is rare, and it is powerful. It allows him to continue growing without becoming unstable. It enables him to adapt without losing himself. It positions him to lead, not by force, but by example. And yet, even at this stage, the process does not end. Growth is not a destination, but a continuous unfolding. The strength that has been developed must be maintained through continued discipline. The purpose that has been discovered must be reinforced through continued action. The mind that has been organized must be guided through continued awareness. There is no final point at which effort is no longer required, but there is a point at which effort becomes natural. The individual no longer struggles against himself. He works with himself. His thoughts, his actions, and his purpose move in harmony. And in this harmony, he finds a level of effectiveness that was previously unattainable. This is the return of strength, not as it once was, but as something far greater. Not loud, but steady. Not forced, but directed. Not temporary, but enduring. And as the individual stands in this new form of strength, he may look back upon the moment when he first felt broken and see it not as an end, but as the beginning of everything that followed. Therefore, let him stand firm in what he has become. Let him continue to act in alignment with his purpose. Let him maintain the discipline that has brought him this far. And let him affirm with unwavering certainty, my strength has not diminished, it has matured. I stand now with a power that is steady, directed, and beyond the influence of doubt. When a man has come through the stages of uncertainty, released the limitations of his former identity, disciplined his thoughts, aligned himself with a definite purpose, and developed a strength that is steady and enduring, he arrives at a realization that alters his entire understanding of life. He begins to see that the outer world, with all its conditions and circumstances, is not the true source of his experience. It is the reflection of something deeper, something within. He comes to understand that the real seat of power lies not in events, but in the interpretation of those events. This is the beginning of mastery, not mastery over others, nor over external conditions, but mastery over the inner world from which all external conditions are influenced. It is the recognition that thought is not passive, but active, not merely responsive, but creative. The man who understands this principle no longer sees himself as subject to life. He sees himself as a participant in its formation. Where once he reacted without awareness, he now observes before he responds. He recognizes that between every experience and every reaction, there exists a space, a moment in which choice is possible, and within that moment lies his power. This power is subtle, yet profound. It does not announce itself with force, nor does it demand attention. It reveals itself through consistency, through the repeated act of choosing thoughts that align with purpose rather than those that arise from fear, through the deliberate decision to maintain direction even when conditions fluctuate. At this stage, the individual is no longer controlled by the immediate impressions of the moment. He is able to observe his thoughts without becoming identified with them. He may experience doubt, yet he is not defined by it. He may encounter fear, yet he is not directed by it. He understands that thoughts are transient, and that his role is not to eliminate them, but to choose which shall guide him. This distinction is the foundation of mental sovereignty. It allows the individual to remain stable in the presence of instability. It enables him to act with clarity in the midst of confusion. It gives him the ability to maintain his course, regardless of the circumstances that surround him. Such a man becomes, in the truest sense, self-governed. He no longer depends upon external validation to determine his worth. He no longer requires favorable conditions in order to act. He becomes independent of the forces that once influenced him, not by withdrawing from them, but by mastering his response to them. This mastery extends beyond thought into emotion. The individual begins to recognize that emotions, like thoughts, are not fixed states, but responses that can be influenced through direction. He learns that by altering his focus, by shifting his interpretation, he can change the emotional quality of his experience. He does not deny emotion, nor does he suppress it. He understands it, and in understanding it, he gains the ability to guide it. This guidance allows him to remain composed in situations that would once have unsettled him. It enables him to maintain confidence in the face of uncertainty. It gives him the capacity to endure without becoming discouraged. This composure is not coldness, nor is it detachment. It is balance. It is the result of a mind that has learned to operate with intention rather than reaction. It is the expression of a man who has become aligned within himself and who therefore remains steady without. Others will observe this and be affected by it. They will see in him a calm that does not waver easily. They will notice a certainty that does not require explanation. They will feel a presence that suggests control, not over them, but over himself. This presence inspires confidence. It creates trust. It establishes influence. And yet, the individual does not seek these effects. They arise naturally as a result of his inner state. for it is a law that cannot be avoided. The inner condition of a man will, in time, express itself outwardly. The one who is disordered within, there comes a moment when you stop saying, I'm just tired, and start feeling something deeper that you can't easily name. It's not physical exhaustion. It's a quiet emptiness that settles in your chest, like something inside you has been carrying too much for too long without relief. You still wake up. You still move. You still do what needs to be done. But something feels different now. Conversations feel distant. Motivation feels forced. Even the things that used to excite you don't land the same way anymore, and that shift is hard to ignore. At first, you try to brush it off. You tell yourself it's just a phase, just stress, just a bad stretch of days. But deep down, you know it's more than that, because this feeling doesn't leave when you rest. It follows you quietly into every moment. And the hardest part is you can't point to one clear reason. There's no single event you can blame, no obvious turning point. It's like something slowly changed over time, piece by piece, until you woke up one day and didn't feel like yourself anymore. Maybe it was the constant pressure, the expectations, the moments you had to stay strong when you didn't feel strong, the times you kept going even when you wanted to stop. Those moments don't disappear, they build silently until something inside you starts to crack. You begin to notice it in small ways. Your patience shortens. Your thoughts become heavier. You question things you never questioned before, and slowly, without realizing it, you start turning that weight inward, wondering if the problem is you. That's where it becomes dangerous. Not because you're actually broken, but because you start to believe you are. And once that belief takes hold, everything you feel begins to confirm it. Every setback feels bigger. Every mistake feels more personal. But what if this isn't brokenness? What if this is a transition that just doesn't look like one? What if you've reached a point where the version of you that carried you this far can't take you any further, and now something new is trying to emerge? Because there's a stage in every person's growth where things stop making sense, where your usual ways of coping don't work anymore, where pushing harder only makes you feel more disconnected. And in that stage, it's easy to assume something is wrong. Most people try to escape it. They distract themselves, numb it, or rush to fix it. But what if this moment isn't meant to be fixed quickly? What if it's meant to be understood, slowly, patiently, without forcing an immediate answer? There is something still alive in you, even if it feels quiet right now. You wouldn't be searching for clarity if there was nothing left. You wouldn't be listening, reflecting, questioning. That means something in you is still moving, still reaching. And that part of you matters more than you think. It's not loud. It's not dramatic, but it's steady. It's the part that hasn't given up, even when everything feels uncertain. And if you learn to notice it, you'll realize it never actually left. Because being in this state doesn't mean you've lost yourself. It means you've outgrown something. It means you're standing in a space between who you were and who you're becoming, and that space is always uncomfortable.